So welcome everybody back to this International Symposium on International Writing. We are really happy to be here and to try out a different format. We are going to have this roundtable talk. Actually, I envisioned it to be, with an open fire here, with very comfortable leather chairs, sitting around and just talking, and maybe, yes, would have been nice, but it looks more like the official kind of Congress party of a party. But forgive us for that, but it's going to be completely different. Let me introduce to you one of our speakers today. It's Lorin Cuoco, who co-founded the International Writers Center in 1990 with William H. Gass and served as its associate director until 2001. She's the editor of 6 books published during her tenure here, including The Writer in Politics, The Dual Muse, The Writer as Artist, The Artist as Writer, and Literary St. Louis, a Guide, which she co-authored with William Gass. Ignacio is going to introduce our second guest, and then we had the idea that the 2 guests are introducing their connection with Bill Gass themselves by using audio-visual material and just their beautiful voices.
Our second speaker is Stephen Schenkenberg. He's the editor and publisher of The Ears, Mouth Must Move, Essential Interviews of William H. Gass, a collection hosted on Medium, and Abstraction Arrive, Having Been There All the Time, with an essay by William H. Gass and photographs by Michael Easton. So please join in welcoming both Lorin and Stephen, and we'll go with the presentations and our conversation with them.
But some nice, yes.
Matthias asked me to read our mission statement before my remarks. The International Writers Center was established at Washington University to build on the strengths of its resident and visiting faculty writers, to serve as a focal point for writing excellence in all disciplines and in all cultures, to be a directory for writers and writing programs at Washington University in St. Louis, the United States and around the world, and to present the writer to the reader. We started and ended with Rushdie. I was just out of college when I became an announcer at the public radio station in St. Louis in 1978. A year later, Dorothy Brockhoff, whose beat at Washington University was the English department, asked if I would be interested in interviewing Stanley Elkin about a stage adaptation of his novel, The Dick Gibson Show, my first famous writer. I went to Stanley's house in Parkview and interviewed him and the director of the show. Dorothy would continue to feed me writers from the university over the years. One of those was a visiting Hearst professor, poet W.S. Merwin, an interview that went so well it became an hour-long program, which would join 7 others in a series of literary profiles broadcast in 1985, including one on Stanley and William Gass, whom I interviewed after Habitations of the Word came out. Recently, I read in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that Dorothy Brockhoff had died at the age of 92, a too small obituary for an expansive, old-school news writer who cared about literature, which doesn't always happen with journalists. There may even be someone here who remembers her. Sometime after I interviewed Bill, I was invited to serve on the board of River Styx when he was the president, and then to join the Literary Advisory Committee with meetings over lunch at Bill's house. Thus began the first time that Bill and I dreamed out loud about the writers we would like to bring to St. Louis. To quote from my preface for The Writer in Politics, without Gerhild Williams, Associate Provost of Washington University, there would be no International Writers Center. We are profoundly grateful to William H. Danforth, Chancellor at Washington University from 1970 to 1995, who said yes. The center opened in October 1990 to inaugurate its special collections mounted an exhibit, Temple of Texts, 50 Literary Pillars, 50, actually 51, works of literature and philosophy that have influenced Bill as a writer. A catalog with his comments about each was published in conjunction with the exhibit. We had many collaborators over our more than 10 years. The first was in 1991 with Derek Walcott, River Styx, and the New Theater, which performed his play Pantomime. Walcott would later go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. His prize winning, after being invited to the International Writers Center, would become a pattern. On Valentine's Day, 1989, a fatwa was pronounced against Salman Rushdie for his novel, The Satanic Verses, forcing him underground. His plight, and that of many other writers around the world, was yet another impetus for the creation of the center, so we said a fervent yes to becoming founding members of the Rushdie Defense Committee in 1991. We held out hope that by the time of our first conference in October 1992, the fatwa's command to murder the blasphemer for a price would be ignored. A fatwa cannot be lifted. This was not to be. However, shortly after our conference, Bill and I flew to Boulder for a presentation on freedom of speech and human rights to begin a symposium on the novel of the Americas. Rushdie made a surprise appearance, spoke eloquently about what literature elevates us to, and then did some of it himself at dinner. It must really get boring talking to the police and FBI guys all day long. Bill's letter describing this visit is digitally archived in the library's IWC section called Advocacy and Programs. In it, Bill describes making the I Am Rushdie buttons, examples of which you'll see in the exhibit. What he doesn't tell you is that he rented the button maker. Maritana, our other staff member, found a Rushdie headline in the New York Times, did the lettering, printed it out, I cut the squares, and Bill worked that machine. It was Mira who designed the St. Louis Literary Calendar. Our first issue of this free monthly came out in October 1991. Our mailing list grew to more than 5,000. Later on, we created the St. Louis Literary Bestiary, an annual directory at the time of more than 100 literary organizations and resources in the area. The Writer in Politics featured Brayton Breitenbach, Neruda Farah, Carolyn Forche, Antonio Scarmata, Luisa Valenzuela, and Mario Vargas Llosa. Each gave a literary reading and presented an essay, which was discussed by a panel of writers and the audience. The proceedings from this was our first book deal with Southern Illinois University Press, and I had no idea how much material would come with the transcriptions, so I asked Bill to write long on the introduction. He did, and in high style. The Writing Religion took place in 1994 with Ivan Boland, J.M. Ketzi, the late William Gaddis, Amitav Ghosh, A.G. Mujtabai, and Hanan al-Sheikh. In preparation for this symposium, I have been reading our conference books, which I have not done since I edited them. I have not read a lot of conference books, even perhaps none. If there are better ones, someone please let me know. Here we have the comedy trio of Gass, Gaddis, and Marc Chenetier, a board member and translator of some of Bill's books, including In the Heart of the Country. It's not just the clever writers and panelists in these energetic discussions, but the audience contributions as well. Our third conference was the Dual Muse, the writer is artist, the artist is writer, in 1997, with Jennifer Bartlett, Brayton Breitenbach, Tom Phillips, and Derek Walcott. Each presented an essay on the twinned theme and also had their work displayed in the Gallery of Art. Special collections presented Una Selva Oscura, an exhibition devoted to Tom Phillips' Dante's Inferno. The Dual Muse exhibition catalog came out in time for the exhibition. The Symposium volume came out in 1999. You can buy the exhibition catalog at Amazon for $584. It would not change my royalty statement one bit if you did. Our offices were in Bill's and Red Watson's in Bush Hall, where the philosophy department was housed at the time. Red was a philosophy colleague, writer, and board member. In 1993, we became the first tenant at Washington University's West Campus, the former famous bar department store in Clayton. Our offices were located in the lower level, which also housed the West Campus Library and Conference Center. It was the best office ever. Not only did bookcases line all the walls, there were no windows. You did have to walk through a baseball diamond-shaped warehouse to get to our offices, but we put on a Metrolines exhibit there and had many receptions. We lived that way until 2000. This location got even better when the wine and cheese place moved upstairs. Also in 1993, we launched the International Writers Center Reading Series. Our first reader was the poet Yusef Komunyakaa, who read in October and won the Pulitzer Prize in April. This prescience extended to Stephen Milhauser, who would win a Pulitzer and a Lannan Award. Two of our four writers in the 1997-1998 series, David Foster Wallace and Susan Stewart, would win MacArthur Fellowships after the season brochure had already gone out. In our final season, 1999-2000, Ha Jin won the National Book Award. I think I recall that this was right before he came in November. I danced around in my nightgown when I heard it announced on Morning Edition. A big year in 1993. We did our Bloomsday reading at Left Bank Books, another collaboration with the New Theater. We went through the night, performing the play in the middle of it. I read the parentheticals. During the 5 years that we ran this marathon, we had more than 70 members from the community read in 15-minute segments. Molly usually concluded the following morning around 9 a.m. In 1994, we began our collaboration with Arts in Transit on the Metroline's poetry project, putting poems on the buses and trains. Later, we would select passages from Literary St. Louis, the book we published in 2000, for posters to be put in bus shelters. There were some terrific designs by members of the American Institute of Graphic Designers. At one point, Market Street downtown had one in a stall for several blocks. That project ended in 2003. By some miracle that could only be poetic, his granddaughter found Stanley Elkin's poster still up in a bus shelter in Chesterfield this year. I will never, ever say anything bad about Chesterfield ever again. In October 2000, to mark our first and last, as it turns out, decade, Special Collections sponsored International Writers Center, a decade, an exhibition in our offices that featured Metroline's car cards, the Literary St. Louis bus shelter posters, Bill's photographs, and those of Michael Eastman, who made portraits of some of the writers in the reading series, and the wonderful illustrations that Emily Pyle drew for Literary St. Louis. We displayed headshots of the writers we brought in, correspondence, manuscript proofs, and all of the St. Louis literary calendars taped end on end, lining the bookcases. Our last program was April 28th, 2001. A day of readings featured Algerian novelist Assia Jabbar, British poet and novelist Lavinia Greenlaw, and German writer Ingo Schulze, followed by a book signing and public reception. The day after a day of readings, we all went into Michael's studio. He made these. You'll recall that I said we ended with Rushdie. All along, we had been trying to bring him to campus one way or the other, especially after he started living in New York. In the spring of 2001, before Bill and I left, Salman Rushdie was proposed for the Assembly Series and opposed by a group of students and faculty. However, academic freedom prevailed once again at Washington University, as it had so many times before, when it was challenged. Salman Rushdie came to campus in October 2002 to be interviewed in Graham Chapel for the Assembly Series. He was also interviewed in the English department's Hearst Lounge by the founding director of the former International Writers Center.
Thank you, Lorin.
Thank you. Anytime I hear Lorin talking about the International Writers Center, I realize how terrible my timing was. I grew up in St. Louis, left in the early 90s, moved back in 2002. I missed all of it, which is just the pits. My relationship with Bill's work started kind of right around that early 2000 period. I had been doing some little book reviewing and writing here in town. Reading Loco was kind of the first big entry point. Ended up launching a little website called Tunneling, which was mainly meant to just help nourish the relationship between Gass's readers and Gass, and hopefully introduce some new people to his work. Around that time, I ended up doing a pretty long piece on the audio book of The Tunnel, which Lorin worked on, which is an extraordinary document. For today's little sliver, I just wanted to focus on kind of three little areas that I have continued to work on with Bill, and it's always with Bill's work, and it's always been in the realm of literary enthusiasts. You know, I'm not a scholar. I'm very interested in his work. I love his work, and I'm always looking for ways to connect it to readers around the world, and it's been fun to do so. So the first of these, up on screen, readinggas.org, this is what Tunneling turned into. Very simple website. It's been up about 10 years or so. And anytime there's anything new going on with Bill's work, whether it's a very obscure essay that someone sends me in another language that we can let his readers know about, or maybe one of the big releases, or a reference to Bill's work from an unusual source. You know, Jeff Tweedy, the lead singer of Wilco, might mention Bill's work as an inspiration, and I'm able to share that with his readers. It has been fun to be on the receiving end of inquiries and queries from people around the world that are either hoping to get in touch with Bill. I got an email last week from a gentleman from Georgia, the country, hoping to get permission to translate Bill's work, and he wanted to do a big, he and his colleague wanted to do a big piece on Bill. A couple months ago from Saudi Arabia came in. So with today's topic around the international reception of his work, that's been neat to see. Just recently I posed a question to some of the readers of this website, who's coming to this, who's remaining interested in Bill's work. The first person who wrote in was from Thailand. Within the next week or so, heard from readers from France, from Portugal, Canada. I think they actually outweigh the number of people writing in from the States. I got, also I posed a question about, and this is something that I think Ignacio and Matthias will talk about, but Gass's place in literary culture. So some of those quotes are up top. Gigantic and unsung. I think we all think Gass's work just needs to be out there for more and more people. These are people around the world that take his work very, very seriously, and some of them are in the scholarly realm, and some of them are just general literary enthusiasts that enjoy keeping up that relationship. The second piece to talk about today is this collection of interviews that I published last year digitally, called The Ears Mouth Must Move. Great title that I can't take any credit for. That's, of course, something Bill said in one of his interviews. There had been a publication of Gass's interviews, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. There had been many great ones since that was published. I was interested in trying to collect some of the best and moving that into a digital realm, including related audio, related video, references to things Gass refers to in his interviews. I think there might be one more here. You can see when he's talking about coming up with the cover idea of Willie Masters' Lonesome Life, or talking about traveling with Gaddis, that we're able through this place and Gass's daughter, who has kept a great record, been able to serve up some of these kind of historical documents along with the interviews. These are about 13 or so across 35 years. I will say the Paris Review, which probably remains the best interview of the entire, all of Gass's interviews, they just didn't give me permission to do this. So it's not in there, but I linked to it right up front because it's one of the very best. So thirdly, abstractions arrive. This was mentioned earlier, and Lorin actually mentioned Michael Eastman, who lives across the street from Bill, and they've been friends and longtime collaborators. This was back around 2012. Bill had written about a 15,000 word essay inspired by Michael Eastman's abstract photography. And in this piece, he really miraculously kind of traces the arc from abstract expressionism in the US through his own interest in photography and ultimately to Michael's work. I had asked their permission and gained their permission to publish it digitally as an iPad-only ebook. As you can tell, I like kind of messing around with technological things and mixing old school media in with something new. This was around the time this was becoming something interesting to do in terms of iPad books. I didn't have a big idea that a ton of people would buy this. I think in the 3 years or so, there were about 250 people that spent the $4 or so. It was a really interesting exercise. The images can get really big and you can zoom in. During that time, I did receive emails from Gass readers around the world that were not able to access it because the iTunes bookstore, which was the conveyor of it, there weren't international rights to this. So eventually over time, as this did get some, I did a little video with them about this, but it did get picked up by the New York Times and the Atlantic and a couple other like tech blogs that were scratching their heads about the author of A Defense of the Book showing up in people's iPad. So there was some curiosity by it, and you can see the graph of the sales were like this, and then the New York Times article was like this, and then it was like this for the rest of the time of our life. So just within the past year, this was a project that we just moved to a different digital medium, published at medium.com, which is the same content management system that I've used for the interviews collection. This did allow basically anybody in the world to read this on any device. So it's less limited. The photography of Michael's can look really, really beautiful. And again, you're able to include hyperlinks to Gass's extraordinary reference points when he's talking about art and literature. So as a side note, I will say that I'm not interested in technology. I read all my books in print, and I love print, and my wife and I have a house full of books. So for me, this is an interesting way to kind of have a little urgency and directness with the community. And if somebody wanted to connect and make a big, beautiful book from Phaeton or FSG, like that would be great. I don't think this is better, but in my role, this has been a fun way to take these projects and actually ship them, to get them out into the world. Thank you.
So we'll have a couple of questions. We'll have a quick conversation with Lorin and Stephen. I think your work is really interesting in terms of how you're really disseminating Gass's work to an audience abroad, not necessarily connected to, the book as a medium in which people are accessing Gass in different markets and different. And I think like it's almost like you're circulating Gass's work for a new worldly audience, and I think that's really, really interesting. Did you expect your work and your interest in Gass to open up to such a large, diverse readership beyond the local, in a way? Because I think it's a fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously all resting on Gass's reputation and his work itself. So I could have had the same type of digital project with an author who didn't reach those heights, and it would connect less so around the world. So I think it's the quality of the work that is making these people have in-between times with these digital projects. So they're going to spend most of their time with Gass's work itself, and maybe between those experiences, they're able to check in and maybe be turned on to a new review or something like that. I will say it's really, really fun just to see what comes through the transom from people. I got an email maybe 3 years ago from Cynthia Ozick, who wanted to fact check that Bill actually said, "I write to indict mankind," which is one of the very Gassian sentences, because she was going to lead off what ended up being a New York Times book review. So there's clearly this audience for him, and I think it's just the fact that someone has a very small little digital thing for him that allows them to gravitate to every now and then.
Yeah, no, but I think what is interesting is that it changes the way world literature traditionally articulates itself, because it depends on some agent in London picking up the book, selling it to a publisher somewhere, and a translator. So I think in a way what is interesting about your project is like it's creating a new dynamic, and people can access the work without having to have a book published in their local store in whatever country they live.
Yeah. And same goes, Lorin, for the work of the International Writers Center. During the 90s, you had really eminent world authors here, as we heard. I mean, Walcott, Vargas Llosa, Marquez, or during the reading series like David Foster Wallace. So what was the influence of those writers being guests here, talking with Gass? Did they know his work? Did they kind of promote it back to their home countries or their communities?
Well, I don't know if they promoted it elsewhere. However, mentioning his name helped a lot in getting the writers. And in fact, what was the year? 1997, 98. When we invited David Foster Wallace, we really started out doing emerging writers, but we mixed it up. So for the reading series, we would have two men, 2 women, 2 poets, 2 fiction writers. And we hoped that we would get some sort of foreign writer, but obviously they had to speak English. But we sort of broke rank a little when we invited David Foster Wallace, because we really wanted to expand the audience. So when we issued the invitation, he called, and I guess it was I wasn't there, and he left a message, and he said, "I'm only coming because of Gass." and then he later talked to Sally Ball, who was the program coordinator at the time, and he got her on the line, and he said, "Now I'm only coming because I want to spend time with Gas. Will I be able to see Gas?" And she said, "You certainly will." So yes, he was obviously a big draw. There were those who might not have known Gas other than name, but certainly he was very admired by nearly all the writers.
Let's talk a little bit more about David Foster Wallace. I mean, Infinite Jest was really big book, and you could make an argument, that without the tunnel, Infinite Jest would not be the same book, maybe.
Well, that's probably right, but I want to say one other thing about his visit is that was our first standing room only reading, and he read from Brief Interviews of Hideous Men, and some people walked out, I got to say too. So.
What kind of conversations did they have? I mean, like Gas and David Foster Wallace and the others. I mean, besides from having the ones on stage.
I think it was really sort of, how do you do it? How can you manage all of this brilliance, the essays and the books? He was sort of he sort of couldn't find the words to talk to Bill. Actually, he was very, very nervous talking to Bill.
I mean, just going through the lineup as well. I mean, if you just concentrate on the poets, emerging poets of the 90s, Anne Carson, Paul Muldoon, Michael Hoffman, all names which are now household names of world poetry, shows an impeccable taste of you and Bill. And how did you decide whom to invite and whom not to invite?
I was mainly the one who identified the writers. Some Bill certainly knew. And in the first year, I'd been reading Yusef Komunyak, and I was amazed that he hadn't actually come to St. Louis because he was at Indiana University at the time. And I just think his work is marvelous. And as I said, he read in October and got the Pulitzer Prize. So he's become a much bigger name. And that's what happened to a lot of the writers. Bill had judged the National Book Awards in, 89 or something. So he knew Jessica Hagedorn's book, The Dog Eaters. And there's a wonderful story about that. She was the last reader in the first season. And in The Dog Eaters, she does this riff on the Ave Maria, where she says, the fruit of your womb, Lord is not with you, the fruit of your womb is actually fruit. And we put that on the brochure, because we always put a quote on the brochure that went inside of it from the writer. And there was a woman that you see in the society pages who was offended. And she tried to remove our funding and got pretty far. And then she wrote the Chancellor, Danforth, who wrote the most marvelous letter defending academic freedom. And I waited until after the reading to tell Jessica Hagedorn this story. But that's a tribute to Danforth. But I'm glad we offended that woman.
Stephen, I wanted to ask you two things. What was it about you? I've essentially given a talk about reading Gas, and reading Gas as a process of reading, the theory of poetics as a reading process. What about Gas's work led you to decide to I want to really do this thing apart from my real life and dedicate my time for this? And also the second question is, which is also kind of connected to what I was thinking about earlier, why did you pick the ears, mouth, must? So what is the sentence, the ears, mouth, must move? Is that a sentence from one of his texts? Because I gave a talk about prosody, and the notion of the ears, mouth moving is somehow really connected to, I don't know why. So those two questions.
Yeah, so on the second one, it was from an interview, and he was talking about, I believe, just how important listening to the prose was as it was being reviewed and edited.
Yeah.
And it was about that kind of writerly process.
Yeah.
It was an unturndownable line to steal. In terms of the first one, I think it's what everybody says, the style on the sentences, the sentence construction. for me, I think a large part of it was his writing. He's very interested in trying to get the very best stuff in front of people. So to try to get to the essence of whatever he's describing, and it could be in this 50 Literary Pillars, telling you your life is going to be better, your head is going to be better by reading these 50 texts. That's why I think he wrote so many forewords, and I think I've learned that people have learned about his work through his forewords. That beyond his own work, you see his enthusiasm for the craft and for people that are interested in moving the form and the craft forward. So at the time, I'm interested not just in reading moving or meaningful texts, but at that age, you're interested in kind of almost a shepherdish, like somebody saying, here's a really great way to lead your intellectual life. And across the interviews, I think I say in the introduction that he'll go from Jasper Johns to Euclid to a movie from the 1920s to Schopenhauer. There was one question about metaphor that in a single sentence he went from Galileo to Descartes to the shadows of trees to the word rose to lines recalled verbatim from Antony and Cleopatra. So there's something incredibly exciting and nourishing about somebody who has that immense grasp of world literature and philosophy, which I don't, and is able to bring that to you in a singular work. It was that rare.
So you really tapped into the kind of understanding of knowledge that you could get into.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But there's a certain, since Lorin was talking about this, people get offended by Guess's prose or by metaphors, and that's probably the reason why he's also so interested in Salman Rushdie, because this is the writer who really got a fatwa on his head because he wrote a beautiful novel, The Satanic Verses. What is it with this kind of aggressiveness? He wrote about the Pulitzer Prize as well, kind of really trashing their selections.
And then great writers get it.
And then great writers get it. Yeah, sure. Okay, but not him.
No.
He's no Pulitzer Prize material.
No, that's not it. No, he famously wrote this essay that every Pulitzer Prize winner is mediocre. And that was pretty much true until Stephen Millhauser got a Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Prize committee is sort of notorious for not very great taste. The National Book Award has been usually quite much better, and the National Book Critics Circle Award as well, which Bill has won 3 of those.
But let's take that away from the literary market, because that's not as interesting. Let's go to the core, to the writing. Does he have this offensive tendency of getting aggressive and taking the reader on, or taking a topic on, or what is the neck behind this?
Well, I wouldn't call it aggression, but he's going to thoroughly transform his subject by his writing of it. He's also famously said he writes because he hates.
Yeah.
But you can't write those sentences and hate. They're too celebratory.
You think?
Oh, absolutely.
I just wanted to quickly, there's something very avant-garde about this stance. Like avant-garde in the sense of the historical avant-garde, in the way that they were proposing these statements and these ideas. And there's also, in my reading of Guess, there's definitely an influence of avant-garde experimental writers in his work. Matthias and I when we were preparing this, we were reading a lot of his work, and he's favoring a particular tradition that is connected with, we can call it some kind of avant-garde experimental form of writing. So the question of his notion of good writing or is connected to that tradition in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel it's an interesting way of framing what he means by good writing. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Two things come to mind. I think one of the first is, like, I talked about he'll stand on the rooftops and tell you why something is this majestic and important. I think the flip side of that is he takes the form so seriously that when something's terrible, and he can have an argument pointing out why something doesn't work. I think maybe that's the stylistic aggression. Yeah. For me, there's another element, which is the not the style, but like some of the topics that he'll write about. So he's interested in that ugliness that resides in people, and I really like to hear him talk about why he thinks that's a worthy subject, and it's what he's talked about Beckett and Jack Hawkes, and that if he's doing his job, he can make something extraordinary and beautiful out of like the ugliest possible, most putrid thing.
Interestingly enough, I mean, for classical modernists, they would come up, or groups, they would coin up a pamphlet and have some 10 theses of what's good and what's not. Bill did never do that. He's like sneaking this into interviews, by the way. I mean, his interviews from time to time really read like, this is my pamphlet for now. I can change my approach.
And the essays too.
And
I think that the Beckett reference is really relevant to frame the experimental form with the nastiness of reality that is permeating through that form.
I mean, I cannot think of any novel which is more about nastiness than The Tunnel. I mean, we were talking about that the other day, and you were both kind of like within the process while he was writing it. You were really closely collaborating with him, Lorin, and after editing him a little.
No, not The Tunnel. He started that in 1966, and up until 1991, many sections of that had been already published in journals. But when he got the Getty Fellowship in 1991, he went to Santa Monica to the Getty, and in that year he learned how to use a computer. The staff there actually hand typed in everything he'd written before that, so it was on with the computer.
Wow.
And within a year, Bill finished The Tunnel after almost 30 years.
So The Tunnel is 1 year at the Getty.
In completion, yes.
In completion.
Yes, but he wrote a lot of new material in that year. Absolutely.
I mean, we were talking also about, where did he get his ideas from? Is it the love-hate for the Midwest? Is it a love-hate for American culture? Because he calls it, I'm digging for the fascism of the heart, this kind of like bigotry. And Stephen, we were talking about the imminence of Gass's work, especially in The Tunnel, for the contemporary situation America is in.
Yeah.
Well, fascism of the heart is that is what the Tunnel is, but he's also claiming that that's true for everybody.
So
everybody's a Kohler.
Okay, so it's about Donald Trump as well.
Sure, even more so.
Yeah, I was. I had mentioned to Matthias, I was on a lunch hour running over to Michael Eastman's house, the photographer who lives by Bill, and ended up going in and saying hi to Bill and his wife. And on the way over, National Public Radio was literally talking about fascism and what's happening. This was, I don't know, about 7 or 8 months ago. But I mentioned to Bill the fact that those had overlapped in the 60 seconds, and he seemed to not be surprised at all. That's what he's been seeing.
Since you brought 50 Literary Pillars, which was the opening exhibition which Bill came up with for marking the beginning of the International Writers' Center. When we had our first conversation about 50 Literary Pillars, you told me that the interesting part was that it is structured like the Parthenon in Athens with all the pillars, so it was 87?
No, actually, I'm just amazed that I've never been called out on that. I'm on record saying it's 87 pillars.
But how many are there?
But in a way there are. There are 86, but in 50 literary pillars. So what happened was that the exemplary Holly Hall wanted to mark the International Writers' Center, so I asked Bill if he could come up with an idea. So he came up with 50 literary pillars, and he used the Parthenon, which is 86 pillars, but that was too much for the exhibition, so we had to get it down to, we got it down to 50. Gerhild will talk about this later too, because I had to correct her on the number of pillars. So, so it was, and it's one of my most cherished things is the 86 pillars that Bill originally came up with. All the other, 36 books. So we got it down to 50, and then at the end, and this was not on the original 86, he decided he was going to have to include a 51st. So that's my pass. But if you can see this, he hand wrote the interpretation of dreams, and then with an image of himself that he did many, many years ago. So it's 51 pillars. So 87 will do.
But the important part is that at the holiest of the holy, the
Rilke
central
and
temple, it's Rilke text.
Yes, and that was what was so brilliant about it, is that the Rilke was always going to be in the sanctuary. The 4 Rilkes were in the sanctuary. So they were always going to be there.
Could you come up with an answer? Why? Why is Rilke so important to guess?
Because for Rilke it was all about the poetry. Nothing else mattered at all. And every single poem was going to be a thing. Ding on sick. What is it anyway? But you were going to say something?
Well, there's that gorgeous book that exists, I don't know if people have it, that, again, Michael Eastman's photographs of Rodin and with Gass's writings on Rilke, which is just extraordinary. If you don't have it, it's really, really great. Thinking back to some of the interviews where Bill talked about Rilke, I think he does make a connection between Gass's own interest in trying to make something beautiful out of the horrible with Rilke's. We had One Tower was great, wasn't it? There was this really big line to him. To me, that kind of continues to ring in his. So that was one really concrete textual.
Yeah. Each angel is terrible. So and it's only the beginning of all what's coming afterwards. But Rilke is also important. I mean, if you reading Rilke, it's also a book about the person, the poet who says he wants to become a poet first before he starts writing great poetry, which is a paradoxical way. I mean, for us normally thinking about it. But Gass is defending him, and from time to time, when you look at Gass photographs, and if you talk with him, or if you had the chance to hear him read, you also have the feeling that he also likes to put on a role. He also likes to play with the audience or with language, with material. Does he also learn something from Rilke and becoming a persona, an author persona? Is that interesting for him? Or?
Well, he talked about aggression, and I think Bill's definitely fighting, but he's fighting for great literature.
Yeah.
I don't know that, other than the work, that Bill would compare himself at all to Rilke. But you think so? I mean, you've sort of said that before.
Yeah, well, I'm fishing now.
I just wanted to say that we also wanted to open it up a little bit for the audience, especially to have Stephen, Lorin, who know a lot of things about Bill's work, and this was also an interesting opportunity for any questions. So instead to open it up for anyone and keep having our conversation as we bring questions from the audience, or any ideas of anyone, or any particular thing that you'd like to ask both Lorin and Stephen, or we can continue.
Because actually you're sitting here with the two most important
and
closest collaborators with Bill Gass ever, and we were talking about that extensively. You don't want to write the biography of Bill Gass
No,
because you love him,
Yes.
as you said, and you love his work.
not that Stephen doesn't
Yeah,
love
thank
it.
you.
Stephen doesn't love
Which
Bill
I failed to
Gass.
say the other day.
But Stephen might actually be the writer of his biography. I mean, I would definitely like that and keep my fingers crossed for that. But so everybody who's interested in Gass should really fire up and ask whatever they wanted to ask you.
But Bill told me that. I mean, you should never write a biography of somebody that you deeply love. I mean, it wouldn't be a very good biography.
It would be a novel. So questions, please.
I was just reading Hausman's writing about the split in his life recently between being a classical scholar and being a poet. And he is the classic example of insisting that being a scholar and being a poet are two diametrically opposed undertakings. So I was really curious how his life as a philosophy professor was integrated or not integrated into his life running the center and also as a creative artist. Or if you talked about that in a way that he thought through the tensions and the productive mode of working in academia and writing creatively.
Could you repeat the question?
I think, we have a microphone. Yeah.
Well-
Sorry, we have a microphone.
You could read.
So yeah, the basic question was how integrated his life as a philosophy professor was with his life as a novelist and running the center.
Thank you, Phil. That's a great question.
Bill says that you have to write both. I mean, if you're a real writer, you have to do both. Obviously, his training in philosophy has, I actually hate this verb, but I'm going to use inform, all of his writing of his essays. And you can tell the story about Plato. Go ahead, tell the story about Plato.
Well, yeah, that's it. In one of the Review of Contemporary Fiction books that was dedicated to Bill's work, they had all these people writing in, and John Barth told a story about Bill once telling him why Bill would never teach a fiction writing class. And his answer was, he said, when I'm reading a bad student paper on Plato, at least I'm thinking about Plato. When I'm reading a bad student story about trout fishing, I'm not thinking about anything. Which, again, is a very Gassian line. I think that he was maybe in a similar way to he talked about the Midwest insulating him from the
Power centers.
The power centers, that's right, the literary nonsense that he didn't want to be a part of. I don't know this. There may be something about being in the philosophy department that allowed him some breathing room from things like fiction writing workshops and that kind of machinery. You would know that close up, though.
No, definitely. The only time he taught a fiction workshop was after Stanley Elkin died. And he made the students read Edward Arlington Robinson, and they hated it. They did not want to read that, but he wouldn't back down, obviously. But also, it's not only, I mean, obviously, they're more than 50, more than 87, more than, 100 or 200, but Henry James is also a huge influence on Bill. And so the writing of essays and fiction was something he was going to aspire to.
But he was a great teacher. I mean, wherever you come up with...
He was a great lecturer. You just have to understand that, I mean, he gave lectures and he published essays of those lectures. And people from, in the community would come to hear him lecture. He did seminars as well in his home on philosophy and literature with a small group of students. And they would go through papers. But the other sort of one-on-one, and I'm not sure Bill did a lot of that, but I don't know.
Yeah, we have one more question.
Yeah, at this point, I usually come and say there's also yet an additional aspect to Bill, and that is the aspect of being a citizen of Washington University, in which he was exemplary. There was a time when there was no big committee selecting dean or whatever, that he wasn't part of. And I've seen him cut through crap like with one sentence, and that was that, and that was that. And there was also a time when Bill Danforth would ask him regularly to write texts to show Washington University to the outside and say who we are and what the humanities are and so on and so forth. So he was a teacher, all the things we heard about him as a writer, and he was also, as I said, an exemplary citizen of the university. Very, very courageous. Salman Rushdie being one part of that. And I think that shouldn't be forgotten because all of us are asked to play different roles at this institution, and he was such a good example of that.
Also a great citizen of the literary community as well.
That's another question right in the back.
So I love the way this panel has Bill Gass bringing writers, incredible writers from the world to the center. Well, Lorin and Bill bringing them. And then Stephen, you bringing him to the world a little bit more, and the way these two things work. And I'm also thinking about the question that you asked Matthias about his aggression. And I think I would argue that he wasn't fighting against bad writing. He was fighting against mediocrity. That bad and terrible writing wasn't a threat at all, but it was especially mediocrity that was being praised. Whereas what he was doing was shining lights on those who should be so honored or praised or read. And I think you see that, and I think, Lorin, your work really helped him do this a lot. His name may have caught the writers, but you knew which writers to catch. And I think, Stephen, what you're doing is continuing the fight against the mediocrity. So I just wanted, this isn't a question.
Yeah, it's a great distinction. I think it's exactly right. I think you're exactly right.
Well, and also, Bill is the nicest genius you'll ever meet. No, I mean, he's an incredibly generous man.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was closest to the mic. Gerhild, thank you for that segue, because talking about the early days, and when you were in Lorin and Bill were starting at the International Writers Center, I was at the libraries, being the first communications person, who I think actually shepherded the temple text through.
Oh, no, we all worked on that. Yeah.
And then into like my present job in '96 with the Assembly Series, I just want to say, as a member of the great unwashed, who is not a member of the scholarly community, what an influence he was on me. And there were a handful of scholars here in the 80s who introduced me to my capacity for intellectual curiosity. And it was really important to me, professionally and personally. One time, I think you got mad at me because I made a big mistake with the Verdins Yosa postcard, because I called them Yosa when it was stupid, and I learned so much from those things. Then eventually read Verdins Yosa. So it was just really an amazing experience for someone who was outside, here on campus, loving the intellectual community, but not really being a part of it, coming from an agency. Back in the 80s, you talk about good citizens, that was something that I think is rare now, but certainly he was a prominent one back then. And Shirley and I are just sitting back here going, my God, this is like a lifetime ago. This is 30 years ago. And it was, so I'll stop going on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's one more question.
I just wanted to ask Lorin, did you ever have differences of opinion as to which were the great writers to invite?
No.
He's a very nice
I would say that there, some of these writers, I'm not sure he was an admirer of David Foster Wallace. I think he liked his essays. But he knew that, we had to mix it up. I don't think there was anybody here that he would thought that was below our standards at all. Even, we had first book people, a lot of them. And that was also the point. So.
Which brings back the question of translation. I mean, those are all writers who were already translated into American English, right? I mean, otherwise, or did you get recommendations from France or from Germany? Because Ingo Schulze, for example, was translated, I think, with Simple Stories when you invited him?
Yes. I think Bill maybe had met him. I don't know actually how we found him, to be honest. Bill had met Asiya Jabbar. I had read Lavinia Greenlaw's novel, and I knew about her because of Michael Hoffman, whom we brought earlier, because that time she was his wife. And then also Mona Van Dyne judged the National Book Awards one year, and she and Jarvis gave us a lot of literary journals and books, and they hauled in all these poetry magazines that smelled like cigarette smoke. But she also gave us a bunch of books, so I was reading through the poetry books, and that's how I discovered Sarah Lindsay, who's absolutely a wonderful poet. So there are all sorts of different ways. And then we had the Irish connection through Gwyn Batten and her husband. So we had Nuala Ní Donegal, and we had Paul Muldoon, and then Elaine Quillinoin. So Heide Ziegler was on our board, Mark Chenentier. So we were getting advice. Anton Chamas. These are all people who were giving us advice for both conferences and not so much the reading series, but.
Lorin, I just wanted to ask you about the Latin American writers that you guys brought. How did you contact them? And also, one thing that I noticed before that I mentioned was that Gas's work is really not that well translated, for that matter, into Spanish, which, compared to other contemporary American writers like John Irving or any other novelist, it tends to be published and widely read in Spanish. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Well, Bill had met Mario Vargas Llosa someplace, and Antonio Scarmata.
Roma's Language Department had a very vigorous visiting writers program, and Vargas.
Exactly, that's right.
That's what I was wondering.
Yes, is it?
Yeah.
Fuentes, Carlos Fuentes. And Antonio Scarmata also was here, and he was on our board.
So those were writers that also were connected through Romance Languages at Washington.
Through Washington University, and that was back really in the other great days. Robbe-Grillet was here. I mean, there was always an international visiting writer here. That program went on for years.
So at least in the 90s, the Midwest was not that lonesome and lonely.
No, well, through the 80s.
Through the 80s.
Right? Or even earlier, I don't know.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the audience or any other?
Because if not, then we just wrap it up, and I would like the two of you to make one last statement of why we should read Bill Gass for ages to come.
Well, I'm just going to say that every great writer should have a Stephen Schenkenberg.
Is that your, It's your way of not having to answer that question too. It's a very nice comment. Yeah.
That was me, Lorin.
Yeah. That's nice of you. Yeah, just that there's an extraordinary quality of the sentence construction and an extraordinary depth of intelligence behind those sentences, not just in terms of someone who is a stylist who can come up with an unforgettable metaphor, but someone who's immensely interested in philosophical ideas. I mean, there's just that intermingling of specialties and interests of his. There's just nobody like that.
So I actually agree with Lorin. You should write this biography soon, and I want to read it and make others to read it so that they read Bill Gass. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.